Okay, David, it's nice to meet you again. Can we just run through one or two basic facts, if you like? You were born in June
the 8th, 1914, in Glasgow.
Makes you 96. 97 later on this year. Well done. You qualified as a dentist from Liverpool?
Liverpool University in September 1936.
Mm-hmm. You then went into general dental practice?
Yes, I came down. I shook the dust of the north off of my feet and came down to London, where I had a married sister whose husband was a dental surgeon in London.
Mm-hmm. And this, I believe, was in Edgware.
I eventually opened my own practice. I had a year's assistantship in London, and when that ended, I opened my own practice in Edgware, which was a fairly new district at the time.
Mm-hmm. You volunteered for the Army Dental Corps, beginning of the war, and you volunteered on Monday the 4th of September 1939.
The war broke out on Sunday. Mm-hmm. I had my papers all ready. I sent them in on the Monday, applying for a commission in the Army Dental Corps.
And needless to say, you were accepted, yes. And then, where were you posted initially?
Initially, I was sent to Catterick Camp in Yorkshire.
Mm-hmm. This was for the basic training?
For basic training, yes.
And from there, I believe you went to
From
Hull?
there, I was, my first posting was Hull in Yorkshire.
How were those early postings?
Yes.
Good? Bad?
It was not a very good posting for me, because the colonel in charge of the number 1 field ambulance a dislike for dental officers. I'd been warned about this by the man whose position I took, who had, what happened was, when they came back from Dunkirk, the dental officers were all given other postings, and we emergency people, wartime people, were sent in their place. And I had the misfortune to go to this field ambulance, where the commanding officer had 2 pet dislikes. One was dental officers, and the other one was Jews, and I happened to be both, so I got it both ways.
Things got better, I believe, though, when you were posted to Dental Centre in Beverley, where you were officer in charge.
I was very unhappy there, and after several incidents with the colonel, I applied for a transfer, and fortunately I got it, and I was sent to Beverley in Yorkshire.
How long were you there?
I was there from about nearly 6 months, until one day a dispatch rider drew up and handed me an envelope which was addressed to me personally and not to OC Dental Centre. And I knew at once that was a posting overseas, and so it proved to be.
And this was the notice of your posting to the Far East?
Yes.
You went initially then to Leeds?
Yeah, I went to Leeds, to Beckett's Park, which was the jumping off ground for doctors and dentists for the Far East, and eventually, after a few weeks in Leeds, we were put on a troop train and ended up on King George V dock, Glasgow, where we boarded the HM troop ship, Cape Town Castle.
But in fact it was a first-class liner.
It was the flagship of the Union Castle line, and I shared a single cabin with another officer. A bit uncomfortable, but not bad.
Yeah. Was the food good on the ship?
Food was terrific. The food was the normal first-class passengers menu, which we got. One of the jobs we had to do was to look over supervise the soldiers' mail, and one and all wrote home, "We've got onions." Apparently onions were very scarce in those days, but there was no shortage on the Cape Town Castle.
The voyage to Singapore took 9 weeks.
Yes. First stop was East Africa.
Then you went to Cape Town?
And then the next stop was Cape Town, where we were given a tremendous welcome. The convoy split in two. Half went up to Durban, and from Durban they went to the Middle East. But our ship and another ship stayed at Cape Town, and because they were destined for Singapore and Hong Kong. And from there we went to Colombo in Sri Lanka, Ceylon as it was then, and stayed a few days.
You arrived in Singapore after a 9-week voyage from Glasgow. You were posted to Gilman Barracks Dental Centre.
I was billeted in lodgings in River Valley Road. It was a lodging house, and the army paid the bills, and I went from there every day to Gilman Barracks, to the dental centre, and back at night.
You later moved to a new dental centre in Nee Soon, I believe.
Later on, I was, what actually happened was at the beginning of August, all army leave was cancelled, and out of the blue, I went to bed on a Saturday night at peace, and I was woken up by loud noises. I got out of bed and went to the front door, and I heard a noise I'd heard in England, the noise of bombs falling, and I fell flat as a stick of bombs fell quite close and killed a number of Chinese living nearby.
Singapore was first bombed in December 1941.
As they did in Pearl Harbor, so the Japs did in Singapore. They attacked us without warning, and we were at war.
Yep.
And the one thing I remember particularly about that was Singapore radio played an old record incessantly. It was a soprano singing "Keep the Home Fires Burning," and whenever I hear that First World War tune, it takes me back to those days with that tune being played on and off the whole day. Apparently it was a warning to British miners in northern Malaya to get out.
Yeah. And they invaded Singapore in February 42.
Yes. I was posted as dental officer to Nee Soon. It was a gunner barracks. The dental centre was between two lots of guns, and the first casualties from the bombing of Singapore without warning were brought to Nee Soon, and I was called to one. Poor man, a piece of shrapnel caught him at the back of the neck, and his brains were oozing out. All I could do was remove his dentures from his mouth. There was nothing else I could do. They were the first casualties from that bombing of a battery in Singapore somewhere.
So you obviously moved away from Nee Soon then to Cathay Building?
Yes. From there, it became obvious that normal dental life couldn't continue, so I and another dental officer called Captain Diggle went into Fort Canning to see our chief, Colonel, I've forgotten his name for the moment, and ask for something to do. And he said, go to one of the hospitals and find yourself work, help treat the wounded, which is what we did. We went to a hospital, I've forgotten the name of it, and started giving anaesthetics and making ourselves useful. There were lots of casualties.
On the 13th of February 1942, the Japanese overran the British military hospital, Alexandria, and slaughtered many patients and staff.
It was my luck I wasn't there, because they behaved, they bayoneted everybody in sight, including, and they took them out in threes with their hands tied behind their backs and bayoneted them, and we lost the staff sergeant of the dental corps and 2 other orderlies, as well as 4 dental officers were bayoneted, were killed. But as I said, it was my luck not to be at that hospital.
Because you had been working at that hospital.
As I could have been.
Yes. Yes. You moved from the Cathay Building to the Central Post Office.
Yes. We moved there and did what we could, helping treat the wounded.
Yes. You were ordered by the Japanese authorities to go to Changi with other dental and medical officers and padres.
After about a week, I received notice that I was to go to Changi on foot.
You were ordered to Changi. Does that apply to most of the other dental and medical officers who were working in the Malay hospital?
No, only some of them. There's my order. I was with about a dozen doctors, dentists, and padres. We were in this first batch to leave this hospital and to go by foot to Changi. So we set off walking down the road. I hadn't gone very far when a truck driven by one of my patients stopped and picked us up. So we arrived at Changi in comfort.
Good.
At least as far as the journey was concerned. But when we got there, we found utter chaos because all the barrack blocks had been bombed, and there were holes in the roof, and there was no food. We just milled around with all the other people who were in the same position.
How many people roughly do you think there were?
Oh, I'd hate to estimate. There were a lot of doctors, medical staff amongst them.
But it ran into hundreds.
And then eventually they, after being very hungry, they gave us some rice, and our cooks had no idea how to cook rice, and you could either use it to paste wallpaper on the wall or eat or drink it, but eventually they got used to it, and at least we had something to eat. Not very nourishing, but there it was.
Yeah. Whilst you were in Changi camp, you performed some dentistry with what little equipment you had.
Yes, doing a little. I had a field dental chair, and it was in the Dobie Court, the laundry part of Changi camp, where I set up with my orderly, and we did what we could for any patients that arrived.
So you had a reasonable amount of dental equipment?
I had a reasonable amount, yes.
Stuff you'd taken with you, or what was already there in Changi?
I really don't remember how I got hold of it, but apparently it was there, and I know I practiced some dentistry.
Other dentists there with you at the time?
No, I think I was the only one. In the Dobie Court, the laundry at Neesoon. No, not Neesoon, at Changi.
After some time you were sent away from Changi?
Yes. After a while I was posted to what was called the southern area. There were two dentists there. I was one, and Jackie Burgess later became Brigadier Burgess and died some years ago, I believe. We were we provided the dentistry for that area.
You sent with a medical party to Bampong in Thailand. Well, this was a 4-day journey by train.
Then I was given a notice that I was to join a medical party going north, and I was to proceed to a certain area in Changi where I would join the party, and I was to be the dental officer for that party, and I duly made my way there and was put on a truck with a number of other people and taken down to Singapore railway station. I had kept, I knew there was first class and second class on the Malay railways, and I was a bit naive. I didn't expect to get first class, but I thought second class might be my lot. So I kept my pillow strapped to my back, thinking I could sit on it if I was sitting on wooden chairs, wooden seats. Alas, I was hopelessly naive, because it wasn't first class, second class, or any class. There were goods wagons with sliding doors in the front, into which 30 of us piled into each one of these, and your kit, such as you had, was in the middle. You sat on the floor with your back to the wall, and the sliding door was open, so you got some ventilation, and eventually you went off. Now, the senior officer, a colonel, was told if anybody escaped from the train, he would be the first to be shot. After that, he went to pieces, and we got very little assistance from our own colonel. I won't mention his name.
How long did the journey take?
4 days. Food, a sort of stew, was served at various stops out of a bucket. It was a slop, and as you left Singapore, you go through Johor, and Johor was the pineapple growing area of Malaya, and the natives in the fields threw large pineapples into the train to us, and you can imagine what this did to our stomachs. This sharp fruit, and when the train stopped at a station, we all got out, and the niceties of civilization disappeared quickly. We used the platform as a latrine, and we left our mark all the way up to Thailand. Every time the train stopped, we piled out and relieved ourselves. If the train was in motion and you wanted to do a wee, you went to the front, and you were held by your hands and knees by your comrades, and you did what you had to do.
You eventually arrived at the camp?
Eventually, we arrived somewhere in Thailand where a Thai angel gave each of us a fried egg on toast. And the first egg we'd had for 6 months, and it was nice. And then we got back in the train, and we got out at where there was a big river. This was the River Kwai. We didn't know it, but it was a river, and we all piled out and lay on the grass, and a very friendly Thai came and gave each of us an oval tin of bristling fish, tinned fish, which, with the rice provided by the Japanese, made a tolerable meal for us, one that we would remember. And this Thai was the fabulous Nai Boon Pong, Mr. Boon Pong, who was our guardian angel for the next 3.5 years. Did wonders for us, absolute wonders. Cash checks, and not knowing whether they would be honoured or not, but he took our words for it. We had those of us that had checkbooks, and he was a wonderful man. And as a story, we eventually got off. We piled on boats and crossed the River Kwai, and we got off, and there were lots of huts there with native women who had quite an industry frying fried bananas, and we could, if we had money, and most of us had some money, we could buy ourselves some food, and we were really, for a few days, we were relatively free. And then there was only one hut into which 600 men piled with their mosquito nets. There were mosquito nets in the huts, and one turned, you all turned. I remember lying there with my hand against the mosquito net and a rat running outside over my hand, and it was generally not very comfortable, not suitable for officers and gentlemen.
The camp in Bampon was squalid, overrun, and the Korean guards were a bit brutal, shall we say.
Later on, Korean guards came, and they were utter swine. I don't know what they've been told, but from then on, unless you did everything they said, saluted them, you got a beating, and when you got a beating, the only thing to do was to fall down and cover your vital parts, because they kicked you in the stomach. But somehow or other, as the dental officer, they left me alone, and I managed to get by.
Later you were sent up to Cheong Kai, where work was starting on the railway.
After a while we moved to this camp, which was called Cheong Kai, and work parties were formed to start building the railway. One day they issued an order, officers were to join the work parties, and the officers moved to the part where the working parties were set up, and refused point blank to work. They said officers do not work, and the Japanese brought up a truck with a machine gun on, and they said, we'll count up to 30. If you don't pick up the tools and go up to work, we'll open fire. Common sense prevailed. You don't argue against machine guns. This is one of the things that featured in that awful film, The Bridge on the River Kwai. The same scene took place there. I had a little folding chair which I set up by the roadside, and started seeing patients. As the roadside was by the just outside the hut where we lived.
Yep.
And I started doing what dentistry I could. And there was an old Chinaman who lived nearby, who had long droopy moustaches and wore a black sarong, and he enjoyed watching me work. He it was, I think, the only bit of excitement in his life. Many years later, I came back to Thailand, and I met his family, and they were absolutely thrilled that I remembered their grandfather from all those years back, and made quite a fuss of my wife and myself.
Did you have difficulty getting dental materials?
Yes. All I was given was zinc oxide and oil of cloves, and a little bit of dental cement. That's all I had to do, restorations. And I had about half a dozen hand instruments, dental chisels and things like that. I hacked away at the tooth to clean it up with the excavator, clean it up as best as I could, and I had a mixture of zinc oxide and oil of cloves, which was my standard filling material, and really and truly it worked quite well.
Did you have any forceps? Have you had to
Yes,
extraction?
I had about 2 or 3 pairs of forceps, and anything that was as I had very little, only 2 or 3 bottles of Novutox, local anaesthetic, I had to use it sparingly. So anything that was a little bit loose, I'm afraid, was cold still.
Did you treat any of the Japanese?
Yes. If they asked me, I treated them. I didn't go looking for Japanese patients. And I remember one day I was very fed up, or cheesed off as the expression was, and I had a Japanese patient, and I was hacking away with the chisel, and I was perhaps a bit rough because he put his hand down for his bayonet, and I said to myself, "Go easy, David, you want to get out of here." So I was a bit more gentle, but I didn't ask for any patients. If they came, I treated them. And one day, the Japanese commandant arrived, and he looked at me, and he handed me 4 tablets of nice soap. The soap that the Japanese gave us was very crude stuff with lots of soda sticking out, and it was terrible stuff. But this Japanese officer put it down on my bracket table, and he looked at me as if to say, "Now, you blighter, I've paid you, go easy." And I got the message.
Yeah. Now, you were talking about a bracket table.
Yes. I had my dental centre, and with the help of an officer, he made the dental chair, which have featured in all the magazines when I came home. It really was a work of art. It was based on the Indian charpoy, the bed. The seat was of rope, and it was all bamboo, and the back was a piece of timber, a small piece of timber we had, which went up and down, and it was secured by a peg which fitted into a hole, and it had long bamboo in the front with bamboos across, so it took various size patients. It also had infestation with bed bugs, and it was. I made a joke that this was a secondary treatment. The pain from the bed bugs would counteract the pain of what I was doing to them. Anyhow, it was a wonderful piece of work. I only wish I could have brought it home because I used it for several years, and lots of dentists used it after we went home, and the drawing of it really hit the headlines. It was in the BDJ, and
Well, as you know,
it was really enabled me to do some fairly good dentistry, considering that what little materials I had.
how did you manage for a spittoon?
The spittoon was a can that had been knocked into shape, and that was attached to the chair.
It wasn't an old helmet.
Wasn't?
An old helmet, steel
No,
helmet.
no.
Okay, that's
No.
fine.
You've got that here, but we had a very good team of Royal Engineers who made all sorts of things, and they beat out from a can of some sort.
Yes,
It was a big thing.
Around.
They beat it into shape, and that was attached to the chair with a piece of wire, and that was the spittoon.
You set up a dental practice in this camp, and you were also able to go and visit other dental officers such as Jimmy James in other camps to share equipment and get other materials and news.
Occasionally I was asked to treat a Jap patient, and I went to Dr. Nobusawa, who was my boss, the Japanese doctor, or the horse doctor as we called him, and said, I need to treat patients properly, including a Japanese soldier, and I need a drill, and there's a dentist down the road who has got a dental engine, a foot drill, and I want permission to go and visit him and take a couple of patients, including the Japanese one, and treat them down there. And he agreed to this. He winked, he nodded at me. I think he knew that I wanted an excuse to get out of the camp, and as long as I didn't worry him too much and stop him fishing in the river, he let me do more or less what I wanted. And I managed to go around and visit Jimmy, and Jimmy had an orderly who was a dental technician. I've forgotten his name now, and he had a vulcanizer, and we had a doctor with us who had lost his dentures and wanted new dentures. So I decided with Jimmy's help, I'd try and do something about it. And amongst the bits and pieces of kit I had were some dental trays, and of course there was plaster of Paris in the hospital, so I was able to take impressions, plaster impressions, and which I took down to Jimmy James, and they made the cast for me. He had wax, so he made the bite stage, and he used to set up teeth using teeth stripped from dead men's dentures. We strip the teeth off and use those, and we managed to make a full upper denture for this doctor who didn't have any teeth, and unfortunately Jimmy James's technician only had pink vulcanite, and they couldn't vulcanize using bamboo fires. It didn't reach the required temperature to vulcanize it properly, and he used dentures for a little while, and then they all fell to pieces. But at least he made the effort. And I was able to, as we had a secret radio in our camp, I was able to pass on the news, the authentic news, to Jimmy, and from him to the others in his camp.
This radio,
Yeah.
it was made by one of the prisoners using a water bottle, I believe.
That's right. It was a one cell set, and what they did was they stripped off the outer covering from a standard water bottle, cut the bottom off, soldered it halfway up inside the water bottle, and then reassembled it with the set in the cavity left in the bottom of the water bottle.
Yes.
And there was a break halfway through, so you put water in, and if a Jap came and shook it, he heard water.
Yes.
And that satisfied him. Yeah. And that's how they got away using the water bottle as our secret radio.
Was there any difficulty getting batteries to run it?
Batteries we got because there was no electricity in Chung Kai, and torches were the standard method of lighting, and we had no electricity, and you got around using torches. And so we had a ready excuse for buying torch batteries, and also for the ophthalmoscope and other medical instruments we needed a battery. So that's how we got our supplies of batteries. And I got permission from the Japanese doctor to go down into the little town Kanchanaburi to the shop of Dr. Boon Pong, where I could buy the batteries, and couple of doctors, we bought batteries and other things that we needed. And then at the bottom of the shop, of the street, there was a chemist shop, and which our doctors could buy various drugs. Now, I ran out of plaster of Paris and for using in making zinc oxide and oil of cloves, and I managed to get some more from the chemist down there. And you may ask where the money came from. Officers got paid. A certain amount was given to them, 20 or 30 tickles or dollars in cash, and the rest was put in a bank account in the Yokohama Specie Bank. Needless to say, we didn't have access to that money, and eventually it came from the money that was had been deducted from our pay in England, and that's how we financed ourselves.
How did you hear that war had ended?
Our people were in touch with Thai workers. They worked together and they got the news from the Thais. For instance, when Italy went out of the war, we knew right away from the Thai workers, and everybody was very happy. They were all singing, "Oh, Antonio, you've gone away, left me on my own, and you know, because we knew that freedom was on its way eventually.
Did all camps get this, or did you pass the information up and down the line to the other camps?
Yes.
Yes.
We passed it. They used to make cigars. We used to make cigars in the camp. You could buy tobacco leaves, and you made cigars, and you put messages. You slipped a message in with the tobacco leaf, and passed it. Working parties from different camps were in constant touch, and you just chucked them a cigar, and that's how they got their news. It had to be discreet and careful. For instance, when Germany capitulated, a message was passed. By this time, officers were taken away from the men. You know, officers and men up to now had been prisoners together, but the Japanese, seeing which way things were going, separated the officers, the leaders, from the men. And apart from a certain number of doctors, dentists, and padres, and I'm glad to say I was one of those that stayed behind with the men, because life was much easier for us than the camp that the officers were eventually sent to, which was officers only, and they were badly treated there.
So the end of the war was eventually confirmed. Did you first hear on the radio?
Yes. Let me just collect my thoughts. We had news of a conference going on, which must have been the Potsdam Conference, and then there were rumours that the war was over, and I remember walking up and down all night. Was it true? Could we believe it? Had it really happened? And when they took the officers away, they put warrant officers in charge of the camps, and word went round that the warrant officer of our camp had been sent for by the Japanese, and we were apparently they were having a concert at the time, and the warrant officer came out, jumped on the stage and said, "It's true, boys, it's all over." And they shouted and they wept and all hell broke loose. Now, I was in a little camp by this time, adjoining the main camp, and there were 3 RAF doctors there, a squadron leader and 2 flight lieutenants, and I was the only army officer there. And the squadron leader went into the Japanese office and said, "I hear the war's over. We want to fly our flags," which of course we've been forbidden to do, and as they're doing in the main camp. And the Japanese officer said, "I'll have to get permission first." And the squadron leader said, "To hell with you, tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock we're flying our flags." And 9 o'clock the next morning we all formed up. I was the only army officer. As I said, I stood in front of the soldiers, and there was a man with a fiddle, and had the flag used by the Padre for the Union Jack, used for fiddles, used for funerals, and the squadron leader gave the signal, and the man with the fiddle struck up "God Save the King," the national anthem. And as he did this, they hauled up the Union Jack, which we'd been forbidden to use. And it was a very emotional moment for me, standing at the salute in front of all the soldiers as we sang our national anthem. After a couple of days, I was told to go back to the main camp, and I went back to the main camp.
This is Chung Kai we're talking about. This is Chung Kai?
Yes. Chung Kai, yes. No, it wasn't Chung Kai. We had left Chung Kai by this time and had gone to a camp called, sorry, I can't remember the name for the moment, but it was a big camp, and we made ourselves very comfortable there, and a British officer dropped in by parachute with a signalman with a signal's outfit on his back, and he was the first man from the outside world to come in to us, and he filled us in with all the news, because we didn't have our radio. The radio had gone somewhere else by that time. And I remember he told me about the Holocaust, the murder of 6 million Jews, and I retired to my bed in tears, and it really was awful hearing the news that way. And then 2 doctors dropped by parachute. One of them had been a student with me at Liverpool, and we recognised each other. And this time we were having a little party, and we were these 2 doctors came in, glasses of booze which we'd acquired, had pushed it in their hands, and they joined us for a party inside the operating theatre netting, and life became much more civilized. And the first meal after we were told, oh, and then the Japanese sent for the senior warrant officer to tell him that the war was over. And the first meal after that, on our plates was half a roast duck, something quite different from the muck that they'd given us up till then. We did have Red Cross parcels.
Did you have Red Cross parcels during the time before war was finished? Were you actually receiving them?
We received them before, and
were they looted by the Japanese before?
They've been looted by the Japanese, and we knew when Red Cross parcels were arrived because the Japanese and the Koreans were smoking Lucky Strike cigarettes and things like that, which they could only have got from our Red Cross parcels. And eventually British Red Cross parcels arrived. They'd been intended for prisoners of war in Germany and had been travelling around a long time. And when we opened them, they contained tins of rice pudding. I won't tell you what the soldiers said when they got that, but you can use your imagination.
Yes. So eventually you left Thailand, went back to, how do you go back home? Via
Eventually
Singapore?
we were, the British, all the time we were treating our sick, there were quite a lot of sick, and as the sick got better, they were sent off to Bangkok until eventually we had worked our way through most of the British sick. And we were told then that we were going home. And they put us on the same trains that we had travelled to Thailand in, but very
cattle trucks this time.
not so crowded by any means. And I remember the train stopped at one place, and I got out to stretch my legs, and a Japanese officer in a very elaborate uniform came up to me, gave me a terrific salute and said, "I'm the station master at this place, and would the officers care for some coffee?" And I said, "Yes, I'm sure the officers would love some coffee." I knew then, I really believed that the war was over and we were free.
So you eventually got back to Singapore and then...
No.
Oh.
We went to Bangkok.
Yes.
And in Bangkok, we were put on the airport, and we stayed there for a couple of days, sleeping rough on the airport, and all the while British planes were coming and landing and taking parties of flying parties of prisoners from Bangkok to Rangoon. And eventually we were told it's our turn, and before this happened, we were taken into a big hut where there were long tables with white tablecloths and plates of bread and butter, and some of the men were so moved by seeing things as ordinary as tablecloths and bread and butter again that they burst into tears. They were so moved. And eventually we were told it's our turn, and they put us on Dakotas, little Dakota aircraft, and flew us to Rangoon. And in Rangoon we were put into a camp outside Rangoon, and if we wanted we could go into Rangoon, which I did, and looked around the place, and I was glad to meet a Jewish chaplain, the first I had seen all that time. All the time we were prisoners, I had taken on the job of acting as a Jewish chaplain to my fellow prisoners and holding Jewish services. I did this because I was an Orthodox Jew, and my father was a rabbi, and it came naturally to hold my religion together.
Yeah. So from Rangoon, straight home? Or?
From Rangoon, we were put on a train, on a ship, a P&O ship we were put on, and we started our journey home. We were a bit crowded, but it didn't matter. We were on our way home at last.
Yes. So you arrived home when?
We arrived home about the 24th of October 1945. We arrived at Southampton, and we put in Nissen huts, and in the first hut we were put in, there was a phone box. I was number 2 to the phone box. Somebody beat me to it, and I managed to get in touch with my family. And then a friendly sergeant in the hut took me into a private room where there was a phone, and he said, use the phone. And I phoned my brother in Nottingham. I remembered his number, and he said, I've just heard on the radio that so many 100 prisoners have arrived at Southampton. I said, yes, that's us. And then he told me something which made me very sad. My father took my absence very badly. For over a year, they didn't know whether I was dead or alive, and he assumed the worst. And he brought my mother down. Our home was in Blackpool in Lancashire. He brought my mother down to London to have an operation on her eyes, and left her there while he went back home to Blackpool. And he was on the telephone there to one of the members of his synagogue to tell them the news about me, when he had a stroke and he dropped the phone and fell to the ground. And the person at the other end realized something had happened and called the police, and they broke in and found him on the floor, unconscious. He had a hemiplegia, and it was just as well it had happened while he was on the phone, because he could have lain there for days by himself and would have died. Anyhow, as I said, he had this hemiplegia, and so my brother told me the news that my father had had a stroke. So the next morning I went into the camp authorities and I said, I don't know what you're going to do to me, but can you please do it quickly, because I've just heard my father's had a stroke. And they took me to the head of the queue, and they sewed medal ribbons on my uniform, on the battle dress I'd been given, and told me that there was a train leaving Southampton station at 2 o'clock that afternoon, and I was to be on it. And so I went down there, and this train, which was full of ex-prisoners who had arrived on the ship with me, all poured out on the platform, and there was my brother. My brother was there. My brother was a private in the Royal Army Medical Corps, and stationed at Woolwich Hospital. And knowing that I was coming home, he had asked permission to be allowed to come and greet me. And his company officer there said, we've got an ambulance meeting that train, haven't we? And the sergeant said yes. And he said to my brother, how long is it since you've seen your brother? And my brother said, 5 years. He said, would you like a week's leave to be with your brother? And he of course said, oh yes. And he gave him a week's leave. So my brother and my brother-in-law were there on the platform at Waterloo to greet me. And when I got home, they told me that my sister was in King's Cross Hospital under observation, and that we were going to make our first stop there. So we put my luggage, and included in my luggage was a lovely brand new valise that had been given to me in Southampton, and put it in the boot of the car while we went up to see my sister. Also on top was a letter from King George, the King, greeting us on our return home and saying how he hoped that we would soon be completely rehabilitated. And while we were in there, a sneak thief forced the boot of the car, which was parked outside the hospital, and stole this brand new valise, and in it were all my papers and the notes I had brought, and he stole all these. And I went to the police, and the police eventually found my papers thrown out on a bomb site. Now this thief must have known who he was robbing, because right on top was this letter from King George welcoming us home. So within an hour of arriving home, I had been robbed of some of my few possessions. A nice welcome home, I must say.
Right. Dear. David, thank you very much.